Addie Harris grew up in a home where silence was a sign of obedience and discipline was the foundation of every interaction. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harris, were rigid, conservative people who believed in order above all else. They dictated every aspect of Addie's life with precision. From her clothing, modest and neat, to her friendships, only those who aligned with their values, everything was under their control. Addie had long learned that resisting them only led to harsher restrictions. It was easier to comply, to live in the narrow path they had set for her. At 21, when her parents introduced her to Warren Granger, a wealthy businessman in his mid-30s, Addie didn't protest. She had learned not to argue when her parents deemed something necessary. Warren was tall, handsome, and charming, but there was a coldness in his eyes that unsettled her. Yet, her parents praised him endlessly. "He's from a good family," her mother had said. "He'll take care of you, and you'll live comfortably." So Addie married Warren, believing that perhaps this was her lot in life. She didn't love him, but she had never been taught to value love, only stability. The wedding was grand, attended by the city's elite, but Addie felt like a guest at her own ceremony, watching her life unfold from a distance. From the very first night, it became clear that Warren had no intention of being a loving husband. He treated Addie with polite indifference, more interested in maintaining appearances than in building a genuine relationship. At first, Addie tried to connect with him, to fulfill the role of the dutiful wife she had been trained for, but every attempt was met with disinterest. Warren's controlling nature began to reveal itself in small, insidious ways. He criticized her clothing, insisting she dress in a way that reflected his status. He monitored her phone calls, questioning her whenever she spoke to someone outside of his approved circle. He allocated her an allowance so small that she was forced to ask him for money if she wanted anything beyond the basics. "Warren, I was thinking of visiting the bookstore today," Addie mentioned one morning over breakfast. She spoke cautiously, knowing that even a simple request could provoke him. Warren glanced up from his newspaper, his expression indifferent. "What for?" "We have more than enough books in the library. I wanted to pick up a few new ones for Hattie," she explained. Their daughter was only 3, and Addie had taken to reading to her every night, finding solace in those quiet moments. Warren folded the newspaper and set it down. "You don't need to be wasting money on more books. If Hattie needs anything, I'll buy it. You have other responsibilities." Addie hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I just thought." "Don't think, Addie. Just do as I ask," Warren interrupted, his voice cold and final. He took a sip of his coffee, signaling the end of the conversation. Addie swallowed her words, her stomach tightening with familiar anxiety. This was how it always went. She had learned not to push back, not to question. She had no power in this house, and Warren made sure she never forgot it. As the years passed, Warren's control tightened, and his indifference turned to cruelty. He belittled her in front of his colleagues, pointing out her perceived flaws as if she were a child in need of correction. At home, he became more volatile, especially after Hattie was born. The cries of a newborn seemed to ignite something dark in him, and his temper flared more often. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, Hattie wouldn't stop crying. Addie had tried everything, rocking her, singing to her, checking her diaper, but nothing worked. She was on the verge of tears herself when Warren stormed into the nursery, his face twisted with anger. "Can't you shut her up?" he snapped, his voice a harsh whisper. "I have a meeting in the morning, and I need my sleep." "I'm trying, Warren." "She's just," Addie began, but he cut her off. "Not hard enough, clearly," he growled, stepping closer. "You're useless, Addie. Can't even keep the house quiet." Addie flinched at his words, her heart pounding. "I'm doing my best." "Your best isn't good enough," Warren hissed, grabbing her arm. "Get out of my sight." The force of his grip left bruises, but Addie didn't cry out. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she cradled Hattie closer, retreating to the far side of the nursery, trying to calm her baby while holding back her own tears. Once Warren left the room, Addie sank to the floor, rocking Hattie gently as she whispered, "It's okay, baby. Mama's here. We'll be okay." But deep down, she knew they weren't okay. She was trapped in a marriage that was suffocating her, and her parents' constant refrain echoed in her mind, "Endure it for Hattie's sake." The breaking point came when Warren brought a woman home, flaunting her in front of Addie as if she were nothing. "See what a wife should look like," he had said with a sneer, pointing to the young woman with perfectly styled hair and a designer dress. Addie stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. She knew what was coming before Warren even said the words. "Get your things and get out," Warren commanded, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "There's no place for you here anymore. You and Hattie can go fend for yourselves." Addie felt like the ground had fallen away beneath her. She had no money, no family support, and no plan. But there was no time to think, no room for hesitation. She packed their belongings, moving mechanically, her mind numb with shock. As she stuffed Hattie's clothes into a small bag, she dialed her parents' number, her hands trembling. When her mother answered, Addie's voice cracked. "Mom, Warren's kicked us out. We have nowhere to go." There was a pause on the other end of the line before her mother spoke, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "Addie, we've told you before, don't come running to us with your problems. You made your bed, now lie in it. We can't take you in. Your brother and his family are here, and we're not prepared to deal with your mistakes." Addie's breath caught in her throat. "But, Mom, I don't have anyone else." "You should have thought of that before you failed as a wife," her mother replied coldly. "Goodbye, Addie." The line went dead, and for a moment, Addie stood there, staring at the phone in disbelief. The weight of her parents' rejection crushed her, but she knew she couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not with Hattie depending on her. Taking a deep breath, Addie wiped away her tears and finished packing. As she zipped up the last bag, Hattie toddled over, clutching her stuffed bunny. The little girl looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes. "Mama, where are we going?" Hattie asked in a small voice. Addie knelt down and hugged her tightly. "We're going somewhere safe, sweetheart. I promise." They left the house with nothing but 2 bags and a heart full of uncertainty. The cold wind bit at their faces as they stepped onto the street, and Addie looked back at the grand house for what she knew would be the last time. "Good riddance," she whispered under her breath, then turned away. She couldn't afford to look back. Not now. The city felt like a labyrinth as Addie and Hattie wandered through the streets, searching for refuge. Every step felt heavier than the last, and with each passing hour, the weight of their situation pressed down harder on Addie's shoulders. Finally, as night fell and the chill deepened, they found themselves in a small, quiet neighborhood. The lights of a modest, well-kept house beckoned to them like a beacon in the dark. Addie hesitated for a moment, then, gathering her courage, knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, her kind eyes taking in the sight of Addie and Hattie shivering on her doorstep. "Oh dear, you poor things," she said, her voice warm and gentle. Come in. You look like you could use some help." Addie blinked back tears of relief as the woman ushered them inside. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't know where else to go." The woman smiled kindly. "You're safe here. My name is Miss Irene. Let's get you both warm and fed, and then we can talk." As Addie and Hattie settled into the warmth of Miss Irene's home, the weight of their ordeal began to lift, if only slightly. For the first time in years, Addie felt the stirrings of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she and Hattie had taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives. The warm glow of Miss Irene's living room felt like a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. Addie sat on the worn but comfortable couch, holding Hattie close as they sipped on mugs of hot cocoa. The rich aroma of homemade soup wafted from the kitchen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Addie began to relax. Miss Irene bustled around, setting the table with care. She was an elderly woman in her late 70s, with silver hair neatly pinned back and a pair of round glasses perched on her nose. Despite her age, There was a lively energy about her, a spark that made Addie feel safe in her presence. "Here you go, dears," Miss Irene said as she placed a steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of Addie. "It's not much, but it's warm and filling. You must be starving." Addie nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Irene. We don't know how to repay you." "Nonsense," Miss Irene replied, waving a hand dismissively. "No need for repayment. You just focus on getting back on your feet. The world can be a harsh place, and sometimes we all need a little help." Hattie, sitting beside her mother, shyly picked up her spoon and began to eat. The little girl's eyes, wide with curiosity, kept flickering around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. As they ate, Miss Irene sat down across from them, her gaze gentle but probing. "So, tell me, Addie," she began softly, "what brought you here? I can see that you've been through quite a lot." Addie hesitated, glancing down at her soup. She wasn't sure how much to reveal, but something about Miss Irene's presence made her feel like she could trust her. It's a long story," she started, her voice trembling. "My husband, Warren. He kicked us out. He's always been controlling, but after Hattie was born, things got worse. He didn't want us anymore. And my parents. They won't help us either." Miss Irene nodded, her expression understanding. "That must have been so hard for you. But you're here now, and that's what matters. You took the first step, Addie. You chose to protect yourself and your daughter, and that takes courage." Tears welled up in Addie's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I didn't feel brave. I felt trapped. Like I had no other choice." "Sometimes courage doesn't feel like courage," Miss Irene said wisely. "It feels like survival. But that's where it starts, and from there, you can build something new." Over the next few weeks, Miss Irene's home became a haven for Addie and Hattie. The elderly woman was more than just a landlord, she became a mentor and a friend. She encouraged Addie to take control of her life, to find her own voice after years of silence. One afternoon, as Addie sat in the small kitchen with Miss Irene, the two women discussed the future. Hattie was playing quietly with her stuffed bunny in the next room, humming a little tune to herself. "I've been thinking, Miss Irene," Addie said, her voice tentative. "I need to find a job. I can't keep relying on your kindness forever." Miss Irene nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, dear. It's important to be independent. What did you do before?" I used to teach piano," Addie replied, a hint of nostalgia creeping into her voice. "I loved it, but Warren. He didn't want me to work. He said it wasn't necessary." Miss Irene's eyes sparkled with interest. "Piano, you say? That's wonderful. There's a music school not far from here. Perhaps you could inquire there?" Addie bit her lip, uncertainty gnawing at her. "Do you really think they'd hire me? It's been so long since I've played." "Nonsense," Miss Irene exclaimed, her voice full of encouragement. "Talent like that doesn't fade, Addie. And you need to believe in yourself. You're stronger than you know." The next day, with Miss Irene's words echoing in her mind, Addie gathered her courage and walked to the music school. The building was old but well kept, with ivy climbing up the brick walls and a sign that read Melody Lane Music School. Inside, the school was bustling with activity. Students of all ages were hurrying to their lessons, and the sound of music filled the air, piano scales, violin melodies, and the occasional off-key note that made Addie smile. It felt like a place full of life, a place where she might find a sense of purpose again. She approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted her. "Hello. Can I help you?" Addie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Yes, I'm looking for a job. I used to teach piano, and I was wondering if you might have any openings." The woman looked her up and down, noting the nervousness in her stance. "You're in luck," she said with a smile. "Our piano teacher just retired, and we've been looking for someone to fill the position. Do you have time for a quick interview?" Addie nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, absolutely." The interview went well, and by the end of the day, Addie found herself hired as the new piano teacher at Melody Lane. As she walked back to Miss Irene's house, a sense of accomplishment filled her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. When she returned home, Addie ran to greet her, her little face beaming with joy. "Mama, did you get the job?" Addie scooped her daughter up in her arms and smiled. "Yes, sweetie, I did. We're going to be okay." Miss Irene clapped her hands together in delight. "I knew you could do it, Addie. This is the beginning of something wonderful for you and Addie." As the weeks passed, Addie settled into her new routine. She taught piano lessons during the day, while Addie attended a nearby kindergarten. Evenings were spent at Miss Irene's house, where they shared meals and stories. The bond between the three of them grew stronger, and for the first time in years, Addie felt a sense of peace. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that Addie's life took an unexpected turn. It was a crisp autumn day when Addie decided to take Addie to the park after school. The trees were ablaze with colors, deep reds, oranges, and golds, and the air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves. They spent the afternoon collecting leaves, acorns, and pine cones for a craft project Addie was excited about. As they sat on a bench, sifting through their collection, a man's voice interrupted their quiet moment. "You know, you could make an owl with those leaves," he said, a warm smile in his voice. "And a hedgehog with the pine cones." Addie looked up, startled to find a man standing nearby, watching them with a friendly expression. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and kind, gray eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. He held the violin case in one hand, and his clothes were simple but neat. "Oh, really?" Addie piped up, her eyes wide with curiosity. "How do you do that?" The man crouched down to her level, his smile widening. "Well, you take the leaves and arrange them like feathers, and the pine cones can be the body of the hedgehog. My mom taught me that when I was your age." Addie felt a strange sense of connection to this man. His presence was calm, almost soothing, and there was something in his demeanor that reminded her of the life she had left behind, the life she had dreamed of before Warren crushed her spirit. "Thank you for the idea," Addie said, her voice soft. "I'm Addie, by the way, and this is my daughter, Addie." "Nice to meet you both," the man replied, straightening up. "I'm Floyd. I play the violin, and I was just on my way to a rehearsal." Addie's eyes lit up. "A violin? I've never seen one up close. Can you show me?" Floyd chuckled. "Maybe another time. But I'd be happy to play for you sometime." Addie smiled at the kindness in his offer. "We'd like that. We come to the park often. Maybe we'll see you around?" "I'd like that too," Floyd replied, his gaze lingering on Addie for a moment longer before he nodded and walked away, his violin case swinging gently at his side. As Addie watched him go, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her life, that this chance encounter might be the beginning of something new. Floyd had awakened a small spark of hope within her, one that she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Addie and Addie found themselves crossing paths with Floyd more often. He would join them on their walks through the park, and Addie grew fond of him quickly. Floyd had a gentle way with her, and his stories and music brought a lightness to their days that had been missing for far too long. One evening, after another day spent together, Addie tugged on Addie's sleeve. "Mama, why doesn't Floyd come to our house? Miss Irene wouldn't mind." Addie hesitated, uncertainty bubbling up inside her. She had grown to trust Floyd, but there was still a part of her that feared letting anyone get too close. After all, she had been hurt so deeply before. Could she allow herself to open up again? But when she looked into Addie's hopeful eyes, she knew the answer. "Maybe you're right, sweetheart," Addie said softly. "Maybe it's time to invite him over." That evening, Addie extended an invitation to Floyd, and to her relief, he accepted with a warm smile. "I'd be honored," Floyd said, his voice full of sincerity. "Thank you, Addie." As they walked home together, Addie felt a warmth growing in her heart. It wasn't just Floyd's kindness that touched her, it was the realization that she was finally allowing herself to hope again, to dream of a future that wasn't clouded by fear and uncertainty. And for the first time in years, as they shared a meal with Miss Irene, laughter filling the small kitchen, Addie felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. She knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. The symphony of hope that Floyd brought into their lives was just beginning, and Addie was ready to embrace it. The seasons changed, and with them, Addie's life continued to evolve. Winter gave way to spring, and as the world outside Miss Irene's home blossomed with new life, so too did Addie and Hattie's future. The once frail woman who had arrived at Miss Irene's doorstep with nothing but a battered suitcase and a broken spirit had found herself slowly reclaiming her strength. Now, as spring unfolded, Addie felt a surge of renewed purpose. Floyd had become a constant presence in their lives, bringing warmth, music, and an easy companionship that Addie had never known before. He and Addie would spend hours playing music together, their laughter mingling with the melodies that filled the house. It was in these moments that Addie realized just how much her life had transformed. One bright morning, Addie stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the room. She hummed a tune as she worked, her fingers moving deftly as she kneaded dough, a skill she had recently picked up, thanks to Miss Irene's guidance. The sound of little footsteps padding into the kitchen broke her concentration, and she turned to see Hattie standing in the doorway, her eyes still sleepy but full of excitement. "Mama, guess what?" Hattie chirped, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. Addie smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Mr. Floyd said he's going to teach me a new song today." "A really pretty one," Hattie exclaimed, her face lighting up with pure joy. "He said it's called a serenade." "A serenade, huh?" Addie chuckled, reaching down to ruffle her daughter's hair. "That sounds lovely. You're getting so good at the piano, Hattie. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Mama." Hattie beamed, practically bouncing on her toes. "Can we play it for Miss Irene later? She loves when we play." "Of course, sweetie. I'm sure Miss Irene would love that," Addie replied warmly. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and Hattie darted off to answer it, knowing full well who it would be. Addie smiled as she heard Hattie's excited voice greet Floyd. "Good morning, Mr. Floyd." "Good morning, little maestro," Floyd's deep, kind voice responded. "Ready for your lesson?" Addie stepped into the living room just in time to see Floyd kneeling down to Hattie's level, his ever-present violin case in one hand. His eyes twinkled with warmth as he ruffled Hattie's hair, just as Addie had moments before. "You two are up to something, I can tell," Addie teased, leaning against the doorframe. Floyd stood, smiling at her. "Guilty as charged. But I promise, it's all in the name of music." "Well, then I suppose I can't complain," Addie said with a laugh, feeling the now familiar flutter in her chest whenever she looked at Floyd. There was a gentleness to him that made her feel safe, something she hadn't experienced in years. As Hattie scampered off to the piano, Addie and Floyd shared a quiet moment together. He stepped closer to her, his gaze soft yet searching. "How are you doing, Addie?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm good," Addie replied, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. "Better than I've been in years." "I'm glad to hear that," Floyd said, his smile warm. "You deserve it. You've come so far, Addie." Addie felt her cheeks flush at his words. "I couldn't have done it without you, and Miss Irene, of course. You've both given us so much. We're just glad you're here," Floyd said simply, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer before Hattie's voice interrupted. "Mr. Floyd." "I'm ready," Hattie called from the piano bench, her small hands already poised over the keys. Floyd chuckled. "Duty calls," he said, winking at Addie before joining Hattie at the piano. As Addie watched them, a sense of contentment washed over her. This was her new reality, a life filled with music, laughter, and love. The darkness of her past no longer defined her. She had found her strength, her voice, and a future she could look forward to. But life, as it often does, had one final challenge in store. Several weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Addie recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Warren. Her hands trembled as she held the envelope, the weight of her past pressing down on her. For a moment, she considered tossing it into the trash without opening it. But she knew she couldn't keep running from him forever. Taking a deep breath, Addie opened the letter. The words inside were as cold and cruel as she remembered. Addie, I know where you are. Don't think you can hide from me. I want you to come back. Hattie belongs with me. You can't take her away just because you're playing house with that musician. Come back, or I'll make you regret it. Warren. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read the letter. The thought of returning to Warren's clutches terrified her, but the idea of losing Hattie was even worse. She knew Warren well enough to know that he wouldn't hesitate to make good on his threats. That evening, Addie confided in Floyd and Miss Irene. They sat around the kitchen table, the atmosphere heavy with tension. I can't let him take Hattie, Addie whispered, her voice trembling. I won't let him. He won't, Addie, Floyd said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand. You're not alone in this. We'll fight him together. Floyd's right, Miss Irene added, her voice steady. Warren has no legal claim to Hattie. You've been her sole caretaker since he abandoned you. We'll get a lawyer, and we'll make sure you and Hattie are protected. Addie looked at the two people who had become her family, their support and determination filling her with the strength she needed. Thank you, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, Floyd replied softly, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. The legal battle that followed was grueling, but with the help of a dedicated lawyer Miss Irene had known for years, Addie fought back against Warren's attempts to regain control. Through every court appearance and every bitter word from Warren, Floyd and Miss Irene were there, offering unwavering support. In the end, Addie won. The judge ruled in her favor, granting her full custody of Hattie. Warren's attempts to manipulate and intimidate her had failed, and as she left the courthouse with Hattie's hand firmly in hers, Addie felt a sense of triumph she had never known before. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Hattie looked up at her mother with wide, hopeful eyes. Does this mean we don't have to worry about him anymore, Mama? Addie smiled down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and pride. That's right, sweetie. We're free now. That evening, they returned to Miss Irene's house, where a small celebration awaited them. The house was filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies, and the sound of music and laughter echoed through the rooms. Floyd played a lively tune on his violin, and Hattie danced around the living room, her giggles filling the air. Addie watched them, her heart full. She had faced her fears, overcome her past, and built a new life for herself and her daughter. The darkness that had once overshadowed her was gone, replaced by the light of a new dawn. Later that night, after Hattie had gone to bed, Floyd and Addie sat on the porch together, the cool night air wrapping around them. The stars twinkled above, and the world was quiet, save for the distant sound of crickets chirping. You did it, Addie, Floyd said softly, his voice full of admiration. You've come so far. Addie leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. I couldn't have done it without you, she replied, her voice full of gratitude. You've given me so much, Floyd. Floyd turned to her, his gaze tender. You've given me something too, Addie. You've given me hope. You've reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's always a chance for a new beginning. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their shared journey settling between them. Then, after a long pause, Floyd spoke again, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Addie, I need to tell you something. She lifted her head, looking at him with concern. What is it, Floyd? He hesitated, then took a deep breath. I've been trying to avoid this conversation, but I can't anymore. My illness. It's getting worse. The doctors say I don't have much time left. The words hit Addie like a physical blow, her breath catching in her throat. No. Floyd, no, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. You can't. Floyd reached out, cupping her face in his hands. Addie, listen to me. I don't want you to be sad. I've lived a good life, and meeting you, meeting Hattie, has been the greatest gift I could have ever asked for. I don't have any regrets. Tears spilled down Addie's cheeks as she shook her head. I'm not ready to lose you, Floyd. You won't lose me, Floyd interrupted gently. Not really. I'll always be with you, Addie. In your heart, in Hattie's music, in every sunrise you see. I want you to promise me something. What? Addie asked, her voice trembling. Promise me that you'll keep living, keep loving, keep being the incredible woman you are, Floyd said, his eyes shining with emotion. Promise me that you'll find happiness, even when I'm gone. Addie sobbed, but she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I promise. Floyd smiled, pulling her into his arms. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other as the night deepened around them. In that moment, Addie knew that no matter what happened, she would keep Floyd's promise. She would honor his memory by living the life he had believed she deserved, a life full of love, hope, and new beginnings. Several months later, after Floyd's passing, Addie and Hattie stood on the stage of a small, intimate concert hall. The audience was quiet, anticipation hanging in the air. Hattie, now a skilled pianist, sat at the grand piano, her fingers poised over the keys. Addie stood beside her, ready to accompany her with a song that Floyd had taught them both. As the first notes filled the room, Addie closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She could feel Floyd's presence with her, his spirit woven into every melody, every chord. And as she sang, her voice strong and clear, she knew that this was just the beginning of the new dawn she had promised herself. When the final note faded into silence, the audience erupted into applause, but Addie barely heard it. She looked down at Hattie, who was beaming up at her, and she knew that everything Floyd had taught her, about love, hope, and resilience, would carry them forward. As they left the stage, Hattie turned to her mother with a radiant smile. Mama, did you feel it? Did you feel him with us? Addie smiled, tears of joy in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. I felt it. I felt him. And as they walked into the future, hand in hand, Addie knew that they would always carry Floyd's memory with them, through every triumph, every challenge, every new dawn. For in their hearts, his symphony of hope would play on forever. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.